Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, friends, to this meeting on migrants, the asylum process, and the church. I am Anita Cano, the Director of Programs and Outreach of Fellowship Southwest. We are thankful that you have joined us today for this very important conversation. For those who are new to Fellowship Southwest, we are a non-traditional network of Christians loving our neighbors with compassion and justice while crossing borders and pushing beyond boundaries. We have 4 priorities that we work with, and those are immigration, hunger, racial justice, and Indigenous ministries. In today's conversation, my 2 amazing colleagues, Elket Rodríguez and Cameron Vickery, will walk us through the process of what migrants face as they come to our borders seeking safety, the complexities that are involved with the process of seeking asylum, and we hope that our conversation will help you, your church, and your communities as you navigate how to respond to God's call to love our migrant neighbors. I'd like to present you Elket, who is a CBF field personnel serving along the Rio Grande Valley. He focuses on immigration. He's also the unofficial legal immigration expert for Fellowship Southwest. And today we also have Cameron, who is our Director of Communications and Development for Fellowship Southwest. She's also a great advocate for migrants and also for public education. So thank you both for helping us and walking us through all of this. And I will leave you with them as they walk through this conversation. Elket will bring all the legal technical information, and Cameron will help moderate this conversation and maybe ask the questions that we're all wondering about as Elket helps us understand the process. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks, Anira.
Thank you, Anita. And I would like to mention as well that if I'm the unofficial legal advisor, Cameron is my unofficial or sometimes official filter. She takes the technicality out of it and makes it simple. Thank you, Cameron. Thank you, Anita.
Yeah, Elket and I have a lot of fun talking about these issues. I call him regularly to ask, the questions that I think must be really obvious, but I don't know much about immigration. I'm learning, and he's teaching me a lot, and so he's very gracious about that. Anyway, we enjoy having these conversations together, and we're glad that you can join us today. Elket, do you want to start with your slideshow?
Yeah. Was it before we begin? Who's going to be managing the slideshow? I think it was Anita.
I am. I'm about to show it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So before we begin, I am grateful for Fellowship Southwest's invitation. This is my family. Know that it is an honor for me to be here with each of you, and again, thank you for having me. What are we going to do today? Well, we're going to talk about the basics of asylum, the recourses, the processing of migrants, and finally, what churches can do. This is a very complex issue, and we're going to have to start with the basics, right? So first, I want to mention, did any of you know that the right to seek asylum or protection from persecution is a human right? This right to seek protection from persecution, which is commonly known as asylum, is set forth in the 1951 United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 protocol. This human right is also contained in Article 4 of the Universal Human Rights Declaration and codified into US law by the 1980s Refugee Act. But before we talk about anything else, we must first define the term asylum seeker or asylum seekers, right? Asylum seekers are people who are seeking, very simple, and bear with the redundancy, seeking to be considered refugees. So when asylum seekers file an asylum claim, they are trying to prove that they are refugees. So what is the definition of refugee? A refugee is defined as any person who is outside of their native country and who is unable or unwilling to return to, or is unable or unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country because of persecution, so persecution, or a well-rounded or well-founded fear of persecution on account of 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Now, a refugee is what an asylum seeker eventually becomes if he wins the asylum case. So do any of you think that there is a difference between who is considered a refugee in the US and who is considered a refugee in almost all countries in the Western Hemisphere? Well, let me tell you, there is a gap. There is actually a gap on who the US considers a refugee and who the majority of the Latin American, mainly Latin American countries consider a refugee. You see, in Latin America, they use the same definition of refugee that I shared with y'all, that the US uses, because it stems from the Refugee Convention that we mentioned before. But here's the thing, in almost all other countries in the Western Hemisphere, they have an expanded definition of refugee. By adopting the expanded definition contained in the Cartagena Declaration of the 1984, to include also those who are fleeing from generalized violence, foreign aggression, internal conflicts, massive violations of human rights, and circumstances that have seriously disturbed public order. What I'm saying is, in the US, you have 5 grounds. In almost all of Latin America, you have 10 grounds, okay? Why do I mention this? Because the wall that divides the US from Mexico is not just physical. It is also legal. Our restrictive definition of refugee makes us deport sometimes many real refugees to other countries. And that is very important to know, because that's sometimes facts that even practitioners don't know. But coming back to the 5 elements or components of proof in every asylum case, we talked about fear, past persecution, or a well-founded fear of persecution in the future. Persecution, you have to prove that you were persecuted. Perpetrated by their government or an entity that the government cannot or will not control. Typically, those are criminal organizations that they cannot or will not control. On account of, we're talking about the nexus. That is the most difficult part of asylum, is showing that you're being persecuted and it is because of you. You know, it is not because of someone else, it's because of you or something that you particularly have on one of the 5 protected grounds that I mentioned. Now, beside these elements, there are additional factors to consider in order to assess an asylum claim. And I want to share this with each of you, because we must know about these factors to understand whether a person is actually has a shot, in a sense, right, at an asylum case. The first one is internal relocation. Because internal relocation is the ability of an asylum seeker to relocate within their country of origin without facing any persecution. The best way for me to explain this is the following. How many of you would agree with me with the following statement? Mexico is a country that is stricken by violence. Yes?
Yeah.
Now, is everybody from Mexico fleeing to the United States? No. So we must analyze whether the applicant can survive without persecution in another part of their own country. Mind you, the question is not, is it safe? Rather than, will the asylum seeker be persecuted everywhere in the country? Give you an example. If the applicant is fleeing a certain cartel that everybody knows, that is led by a leader that everybody knows, that has ties with the whole government in the whole country that everybody knows, then it's very tough for that person to stay and protect himself or herself or her family or his family in that country. Are you getting what I'm saying? So we get an understanding of what asylum is. So there's another factor.
I had never thought about that before, that you just moving to another part of your country is an option that could disqualify you from coming to America from asylum.
Yeah, and that is why the asylum claim of, and I'll be totally honest, the asylum claims of Cubans and Venezuelans and Nicaraguans being communist countries that have a lot of control over what you eat, how you move, the jobs you get. It's, you would say, I'm not saying that it would be easier, but it's easier to prove that part because
it legitimizes that.
It is the government itself. Now, criminal organizations are political actors, and they become, you would say, stronger, if you can say that word, or political actors in certain countries than even political parties. And so it becomes a more difficult proving element for an attorney to prove that. But yeah, but it still can. Like, I would say, people say, well, that cartel is not the one that controls that area. Yeah, but you know what? They smuggle things around countries. So if you're in Guatemala, in El Salvador, that cartel that you're fleeing from has you would say, a memorandum of understanding with other cartels that are around, and you get caught up in that turf war, or with another cartel that, or criminal organization that works for you. So that is another claim that you can make. And another claim that many migrants make in those countries is, if I go and make a police report about what happened to me, the police will notify them wherever we are. So those are the elements that we have to take into account in these cases. Okay. The other factor to consider is firm resettlement in another country. First, firm resettlement is very nuanced and very susceptible of proof. For firm resettlement to apply, the applicant, or the asylum seeker, needs to enter another country prior to arrival in the United States, a third country, what we would call a third country. And while in that country, the applicant received, so it's not coming from him, it's coming from that country's, an offer of permanent resident status, citizenship, or some type of permanent resettlement. There's 3 requirements. Bear in mind: entry into a third country, an offer or receipt of a status that is permanent. So if I tell you can stay here temporary, no, that's not a firm resettlement. Am I getting?
So yes. So a lot of the people that are migrating, intending to come to the United States, end up, in Mexico for a while, maybe say in Piedras Negras. I know this happens a lot there. And they end up finding a job and liking it there. But that's not necessarily permanent resettlement. They can still apply for asylum in the United States, even though they're maybe going to be there for a while and work.
Correct. And this is the idea behind it. Once you get the rationale, you're going to get the requirements. Because the rationale is, the US government wants to determine whether the applicant is seeking refugee status, and here's the part, as a consequence of his flight to avoid persecution, and not as a way to curve the system and get into the United States. So it's a little tough, and you got to get intentional and get information, but yeah, it's part of it. And the third factor to consider, this one is easy, which is if the asylum seeker is a terrorist, a persecutor himself, has a previous asylum denial, or has committed certain serious crimes. In these cases, they're banned or barred from seeking asylum. And the last one is the fourth is discretion. Discretion is everywhere in immigration law, because the law says that the US may grant asylum. And so any facts related to the person's conduct, character, family ties, property, lawful ties to the US, immigration status, humanitarian concerns are appropriate for a judge or an asylum officer to exercise discretion.
This is why it's so important who we elect and appoint as judges, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And many of them are previous trial attorneys for the Department of Homeland Security. So they work for the government, and they kind of have a framework already established. What are the benefits of being granted an asylee status? Here's like the crown, the queen in the chess game. Asylees get to remain in the United States, protected from danger in their country. Like, that's obvious. They're authorized to work. And here's the important part. They can adjust status within 1 year of their grant of asylum. So inside the US, they can ask to become legal permanent residents or move to other status. And further, asylees can petition for, and this is very important, and provide their asylee status to their spouses and any unmarried children who were under the age of 21, important, at the time of the application, when the application was received by the government. It is very important to know that.
Even if that spouse or child is not in the United States at the time.
Correct.
Be
Correct.
granted asylum and be permitted to come in. And
They
join.
can pass it on. They can pass it on. That's why the I-589, which is the form you file, has a part where you kind of say who are your family, your biographical.
This is why families don't always migrate together. Like, they'll send one person, maybe the dad or the mom will come, and then.
Well, I would say that happens a lot, but I would not say like that is why it happens. It typically happens because of other factors. Like I mentioned before, I'm the one being persecuted, but I know that my family can hide in other places. And so it is more, what I'm trying to say is, yes, it can be one of the factors, but the main factors are either economical, in the sense that I need to go, and they are more of, I'm sorry, it was not economical. What I was trying to say, it's a matter of protection, safety, first. Yeah, that's why I have to flee. I have to leave the country right now. Maybe my family not. I don't have the money to bring my family right now. So there are different arrangements that families find themselves when they're being persecuted that we cannot write them off. I mean, they're case by case. Yeah. So another thing is that there is a deadline to file for asylum. Not going to spend a lot of time here, but it's a 1-year deadline. They have to file their asylum within 1 year. And so the 1-year deadline is extremely harsh sometimes, but there are exceptions, like changed circumstances or extraordinary circumstances. I'm not going to get into that detail, but there's a 1-year deadline. So if you're talking to someone that is trying to seek asylum, tell them that they have a year since they came to the US to, ask for asylum.
So
now
these are
the question,
people that crossed
I'm sorry?
over. These are people that have crossed over. They're
Yeah.
in the United States. They have a year to apply for asylum. Okay.
Anyone. It is anyone that's in the US that has crossed over, whether they were allowed by Customs and Border Patrol to get into the United States through parole or not. They have a 1-year deadline. Even if you're undocumented, you have a 1-year deadline in the US. If you came with a tourist visa for vacation, and then your country, there were changed circumstances, you have a year. In this case, since the situation happened, to ask for asylum in the United States.
Okay.
You get it? So, okay. Are there other alternatives besides asylum for those who fear being deported to their countries? Yes. And I want to mention this because sometimes we get to the screening of asylum and we forget that there are other alternatives. Not going to get into the technical details, but I'll just skim through them. Yes, there is the withholding of removal and the Convention Against Torture. The first one I'm going to talk is withholding of removal. This is a non-discretionary form of relief that is available to applicants who establish that it is more likely than not that they will face persecution in their country of removal by their government or an entity that the government cannot or will not control on account of the 5 protected grounds. What I'm trying to say is, so you'll get it when I tell it. So whom do you think may benefit from withholding? Those that are ineligible for asylum, because that one is discretionary. This one is not discretionary. those that have an asylum bar, those that filed outside of the 1-year deadline, those who have a reinstated removal order, those who have negative factors because of their criminal history. And so I want to mention that withholding of removal means that an individual is ordered removed. So the judge says you are removed. I'm just withholding your removal. Okay. And this can only be granted by an immigration judge. Okay. But the benefits are very, I would say they're not as good as asylum. They can remain in the US so long as the conditions in their home country do not improve. If they improve, because I'm withholding the removal, I can exercise the removal. They're not eligible to adjust status, and they're not eligible to pass withholding to anyone because it's not a benefit. I'm just withholding an order. And finally, they can work, but it's renewed annual. Okay. And the last one is Convention Against Torture. Pretty much, let's put it simple. The US will not return or should not return someone to a country that they believe is going to be tortured. And additionally, unlike asylum, which is the only difference, unlike asylum and withholding, you don't have to establish that you fear torture on the 5 grounds, okay? Which is something that's more open, right? And you can prove it. It allows for a work permit, permission to remain in the US, and like I said before, order removed, but then suspended. But this is after asylum. These are the remedies asylum seekers have. Now, methods to file for asylum. There's 2 ways, very quick: affirmative and defensively. Defensively is when the government starts the process. They file an NTA, notice to appear, with an immigration court, and so they, in a sense, they're like they're starting the process against you. The immigration judge is the one that presides over the proceedings, and so you can ask for these recourses. Affirmative is different. Affirmative is I am in the US, and within that first year, that first year deadline, I decide that I will file for asylum, because if I go back to my country, so I'm here legally in a sense, right? Or undocumented, but I'm not going back to my country. I don't want to go back, and I want to present it and say, hey, consider me for protection from persecution. And so it's different, and that one is filed in the US Citizenship and Immigration Services. They adjudicate those. Okay? Okay, perfect. So when you file for asylum, you're filing, like I mentioned before, the form I-589, and you should file for 3 different reliefs: asylum, withholding, and protection, like I mentioned. And so
you file for all 3 at once, like this automatically?
Not automatically for the protection under Convention Against Torture. I always tell, there's 2 check boxes that you have to check to be screened for Convention Against Torture. And the first page in the top on the left, and then on the, I think it's the 3rd or 2nd page, you have to say that you want to be screened for Convention Against Torture. That is very important. But the other ones are going to be, because you're filing for it.
Elket, do you know off the top of your head what percentage of people that file this form are approved for one of those 3?
No, I don't know it. I looked at the numbers, actually, I have to say, about 3 weeks ago, but now I forgot. I know that the numbers were here in Texas, in our area, it was 75% grant of denial in asylum. It is better than before. Let's just put it that way.
So 25%.
75. Yeah, 25% grant.
25% were approved. Okay.
I don't remember if it was 40 or 60%, granted in New York. I think it was 60 granted and 40 not granted. But I know that there are forums or places or states in the US where they grant more asylum. They hand out more asylum grants than others. And Texas is one of the most restrictive, if you can
We
say.
probably also have the most applicants, right?
You can say, yeah, you can say it is. Yeah, especially on the South, it is tougher. California, Texas, California, Illinois, and New York have higher grant approvals than Texas by far.
Mhm.
And so let's talk a little bit about the work permit, because that's what a lot of people care. If that person is here, when they're going to work. Well, here is the thing. 150 days after the filing, the asylum seeker can apply for a work permit. Okay. I recommend, and this is very important for the asylum seekers, to file a membership with ASAP, and the Asylum Seeker Advocacy Project. Not going to get into a lot of details, but this group won a federal case to actually maintain that right for asylum seekers to seek to get a work permit, or at least to present, right, and file a work permit in 150 days. And 30 days later, this is what the case that they won says. 30 days later, the applicant should be eligible for a grant on that permit. So if you count that time, you have to file a different document, which is the employment authorization document. What we know, the form I-765, but pretty much it's 5 days, 150 days after you file the I-589, which is your asylum claim. You have the right to ask for a permit to work, and then 30 days after, the government will grant it. So the best way to do it, file membership with ASAP so that you can become part of those that are in that case, and you'll get the grant as soon as possible.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Number one, going back to filing for asylum, can you only, and how different states have different, grant different amounts, and can you only apply for asylum in the state where you are when you apply? Or if you come in and you're in Texas, but you know that maybe you have a better chance in New York, can you apply for asylum in New York?
You can move. You can ask for a change of venue. You can ask for a change of fat.
You have to be present in that state.
Well, yeah. So because you have to, if you're an asylum seeker, let's say you got the filing in Texas because you were staying with your sister that is in Texas. Let's say that.
Okay.
And so then you have another sister that it's in New York, and you're going to move there. And you move there, you still have your asylum, your case in Texas. So you have to file for a change of address. And the change of address do not necessarily changes the venue. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of asylum seekers do not know that. They need to, because you're telling the court, I am living in New York, but you're not asking the court to change the venue. Because maybe they think, hey, that person will come back. But then if you ask a change of venue with a change of address, the court will consider it and probably do it, allow the change of venue. And you can continue your case in New York.
Okay. Second question is about
those
documents. Essentially, you can't work for 6 months. 180 days or 150 days to 180 days whenever they grant.
You're not authorized to work.
You're not authorized to work, right. And so you are staying with a sponsor and you're just at their, relying on their hospitality.
Yeah, totally.
Officially. Okay.
Yeah.
I just think that's important to think about.
Yeah. And that is the most difficult part of all this process. For
and
sponsors
can I also add that you have no right to seek any kind of public help either. You can't ask for any kind of welfare any kind of welfare from the government.
Mhm.
The idea behind this is, and I think this is the idea, I have not seen it, but I still believe the idea is to protect, I mean, people may come at me, but I think the idea behind should be to protect the American worker, because if not, you can show up, get work quick. You know what I'm saying? And at the same time, deter some, I think, labor practices that still happen. We all know
Okay.
that. They still happen.
Still, it feels like a long time, but okay.
Yeah, it is. Then let's talk a little bit about processing, which is what everybody is interested right now, because there's been so many changes.
Just
So
the next slide.
I'm sorry.
You need the next slide.
Yeah, the next slide. So processing. So I'm gonna try and be as blunt as possible with what is happening at the border and the processing, because processing is always an issue at the border and it changes. So probably tomorrow it may change what I'm saying today. It has happened to me a lot of times. So Title 42 and the expansion to Venezuelans, Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Haitians. So Title 42 is the name used to describe the COVID-19 health policy that authorizes the rapid expulsion of migrants, primarily to Mexico, without offering migrants the opportunity sometimes to seek asylum. This, or most times, to seek asylum. This policy has been implemented continuously with several adaptations and versions since March of 2020. And so let's talk about Venezuelans first. Prior to October 19th, 2022, Title 42 did not generally apply to Venezuelans because the US does still to this day does not have open diplomatic relationships with Venezuela. Venezuela was not accepting deportation flights from the US, and Mexico was not accepting Venezuelans that were expelled Venezuela under Title 42. Therefore, the US had to, in a sense, release many Venezuelans into the US territory and allowing them to stay in the US to continue their asylum case in the territory. But starting, and again, I say October 19th, 2022, Title 42 was expanded to Venezuelans after the United States reached an agreement with the Mexican government to receive them. So from October 19th on, any Venezuelan who tries to enter irregularly into the US, Mexico, or Panama, those three countries, be it understood by the river or crossing a wall or anything, will be expelled back to Mexico, okay? But this policy was good until January 6th, which is a week ago. Then on January 6th, this same Title 42 process was extended to Cubans, Haitians, and Venezuela and Nicaraguans. Why? Because Mexico also agreed, and now they put a cap on it. They agreed to receive 30,000 expelled migrants from, and I'll say, Cubans, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, and Haitians. They're allowed to receive, in a sense, right? Through Title 42, 30,000 expelled migrants each month. So that would be, each month. Bear in mind that these countries were not accepting deportation flights from the US either, okay? So that's kind of like the trade-off. At the same time, and this is because the US Mexico had to give something, the US had to give something. At the same time, since January 6th, the US is paroling, an interesting word to say, allowing entry, of 30,000 individuals from these four countries, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Haiti, per month, who have an eligible sponsor and can pass a vetting and background check. These sponsored migrants, is the word that I sometimes use, can come to the US for a period of 2 years.
What kind of migrants?
I would say sponsored. I mean, if they have a sponsored, yeah. They can come into the US for a period of 2 years and receive a work authorization. The sponsor is in control of everything. They go on the internet, they file their claim in the USCIS webpage. they give out financial information, and then they're going to sponsor a Venezuelan, a Cuban, or Nicaraguan, whatever. And so they pay for the travel, and they should come to the US, and then they do another vetting, but they are allowed to come in. And the sponsor has to prove that they can maintain this migrant for 2 years, up to 2 years. But this process is barred for those individuals who irregularly cross. In the case of Venezuelans, it was October 19th. In the case of Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans who crossed illegally through Panama, Mexico, or the US after January 6th. Okay? It's important to understand. It's different dates for when they can come in. Now, the US is still accepting Ukrainians with sponsors.
Before you move to Ukraine, the 30,000 that Mexico will accept, is that 30,000 from each of those countries or 30,000 total?
For each of these countries. It's 30,000 for all the countries.
The total
and the
per month, right?
Total per month, and the US will accept 30,000 and allow them to come into the US.
Will accept 30,000 total per month through humanitarian parole.
Correct, which will be 1,000 per day.
1,000 per day.
Yeah, pretty much.
Total from all those countries. Which country has the most? Do you know right now per day?
Oh no, I believe that Venezuelans have the most because of how many of them were coming in the last, and they already had a process back in October 19th. So I would say that they have the most, right?
I think I read somewhere that like a quarter of Venezuelans have left Venezuela in the last.
Since 2015, Venezuelans have around, I don't know if it was 2.5 million or it was getting to 3 million Venezuelans have left their countries because of the high inflation, the Maduro regime, and the Chavez regime. So,
okay, after the 2 years that they've been on humanitarian parole, what happens to them in the United States? Can they apply to change their status?
That's something that remains to be seen depending on their circumstances. You have to assess the case and make a decision. They can file for asylum inside the US, probably affirmative, probably not affirmatively as well, within the deadline. So I do believe that many of them will choose that option, and it will depend. I don't know if the government will continue to expand the process, or so it's tough to say right now what's going to happen exactly. Okay. Yeah, the same process is used for Ukraine, pretty much. The Uniting for Ukraine is still happening, and sponsors can sponsor Ukrainians, and so the question remains, and I know that Cameron will ask me, which is what happens if there are vulnerable migrants stuck in Mexico or already underway and do not have a sponsor? Well, starting yesterday, Customs and Border Patrol, if you hear me say CBP, it's the acronym we use all the time, updated the CBP1 app for those vulnerable migrants to set up appointments to be screened at different ports of entries. So access to making an appointment will be based on individuals who are physically located near the US-Mexico border and some major population centers, probably like Mexico City or Monterrey. And so the idea is for them to, through that app, ask for appointments to be screened and see if they can be exempted from Title 42 if they're vulnerable, and they can continue their asylum case in the US.
Okay, so here's an important question.
Yeah.
Are they operating under the assumption that all of these migrants have a smartphone?
Oh, well, yeah, we're operating under that assumption. I mean, the US government is operating under that assumption.
And do most of them have a smartphone? I mean, I've been to these camps and most people do seem to have phones. There's these charging stations, everywhere. And, but surely not everyone does. That's got to exempt a lot of people or exclude a lot of people.
It exempts some people. I would not say, well, a lot, because there's a lot of people coming. but most of them have cell phones. Those that don't have cell phones, I think they must show up at a port of entry and mention that. But right now, to be honest with you, I do not know how the U.S. government will deal with these type of cases, especially because this is a policy that started being implemented yesterday. Let's see what happens.
And I guess it's definitely headed in the right direction. It's progress in the right direction. It's not perfect. I know Anira and I were talking about how they may have a phone, but it might not have the space required to download this app and to do this lengthy application. So
yeah,
it's not perfect, but I guess it's better than 2 days ago. So okay.
Yeah, I think it is. Before 2 days ago, so there were not NGOs and private attorneys filing exemptions with the Customs and Border Patrol every month or every day. And so what they're doing is actually taking that off cutting off the middleman so that migrants can do it themselves and don't have to pay for the service. Whether that's good or not, it's tough because it's still an intelligence agency. CBP is part of DHS, and you're handing out a lot of information from you.
Yeah.
And if you consider it that you're coming from probably typically for a poorer country, you're giving the US a lot of data that they should not have. So that's another thing to think about, but I'm not going to go that route right now, but just FYI. And the last one is Title 8 and regular processing. So whenever you hear Title 8, that is the book, if you can say, in the US code that deals with nationality and immigration. Title 42 is the one that deals with health and healthcare laws. And that's why it's called Title 42, because it kind of overpassed Title 8 because of COVID. Anyways, but Title 8 is regular processing, typically. So why I'm bringing this up, because what happens if more than 30,000 migrants from these 4 countries that we talked about are already, the US already now try to get across? Let's say that 30,000 migrants try to get to this country, to the US, and the US has already expelled 30,000 to Mexico under Title 42. What happens to 30,001?
Yeah.
Well, based on what I read on the administration's information that was pulled out in DHS and the Department of Homeland Security memo, it seems the US will then use the Title 8 authority and resort to expedited removal, deporting these migrants back to their countries subject to a 5-year ban of free entry. Okay, that's what I think. Again, this is happening. This is already starting to be implemented since January 6th. We have not gotten to the cap, but that's my interpretation of what the government said about the 5-year ban. It's like, we're going to use Title 42, but again, if we're done, we'll probably use Title 8 because it's they have to process you through a law, right? A body of laws. And so that's what I think they're going to do. And finally, this is the most important part, people. The Department of Homeland Security, CBP, and ICE have discretion to process migrants. Therefore, there are like 7 ways I've seen or more migrants come in and be put in different settings. Some of them go to detention, some of them are parole, some of them get out on a alien booking record or I-385, some of them get already out of the detention facilities or the CBP offices with a notice to appear. So government has discretion in how they're going to process you. So there's now one way of processing migrants or asylum seekers. So FYI, you're going to have to read the documents that they bring with themselves before you can make an assessment.
Okay, Elket, I have sort of an overarching question about Title 42.
Yeah.
For a long time, we have been advocating for Title 42 to end.
Yeah.
And because, backing up, in 2020, it was a CDC protocol to help protect from the spread of COVID-19. And
Yeah.
then when that risk went down, and clearly Americans were not seeking restrictions against COVID-19 anymore, the administration was still using it as a way to manage immigration. And so
Yeah.
now, and they are still doing that. And so now it has really changed from being a health protocol to an immigration management tool. And it has continued to evolve, like you've said, and now we have all these expansions and exemptions. And are we, as Fellowship Southwest, are we still advocating for the end of Title 42? How does that change our advocacy?
I do believe that Title 42 should be ended, like right away. And the reason why is because, like the government mentioned, first, there is no health rationale to use this policy right now. Second, so the first thing you need to have as a government is a rationale to implement your policies. If not, we're living in a dictatorship. And well, we should have a conversation about that too. But long story short is that, but not now. But the rationale doesn't work, but the policy doesn't work.
Mhm.
So the proponents of Title 42 have always said, oh, it is a way to deter migration. So can you tell me how come last year we had the highest number of apprehensions at the border if we were implementing Title 42? So how come this policy really worked to manage the border when you have more people coming in through this policy than Title 8? So that is the question that I think the government needs to answer, and I don't think they're going to answer it, or they don't want to answer it. Title 42 is bad for border management because you can expel people and they can come back. You're not giving them a final decision on their asylum claim. And
It
so families
encourages-
cannot make decisions.
It encourages repeat crossings, right?
It encourages repeat crossings, and to be honest, it creates a more humanitarian problem because cartels continue to kidnap and murder and to be honest, rape and exploit those migrants when they come in, when they come back, when they come in, when they come back. You're actually giving these criminal organizations more work in a sense, right?
More business, yeah.
More business, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And finally, what churches can do, and I'll try to be quick in this, you can participate in a mission trip to the border. You can assist in recollecting clothing, travel kits, backpacks, shoelaces, shoes, hygiene kits, Bibles for respite centers. And we can continue going.
Tell them why shoelaces are in high demand.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Because when migrants go to detention centers or asylum seekers, they go to detention centers and they take away their shoelaces out of what they call security, so that they don't hang themselves, let's be honest, and use those like shoelaces for other purposes. And so once they're released from the detention, they show up at welcoming centers here in Brownsville and in Reynosa and everywhere with their shoes, but without the shoelaces. And so that's why it is very important to the shoelaces at this time. Consider opening a mid to long-term shelters for asylum seekers. Respite centers need churches or organizations that are willing to shelter for quite some time asylum seekers that cannot stay in the respite center for a month, because that is a respite center that is receiving 100 people, 1,000 people a day or something. They need to move them away, and some of them don't have sponsors. Hey, consider opening an immigration legal services organization. Plan an outreach event for migrants in your community. You're going to see some asylum seekers in your community once you do that. And finally, advocate for immigration reform by contacting lawmakers. I mean, we have a system that is so broken that even a guy like me has to spend an hour explaining it. And it's still not understandable in all the ways. it can operate. So I think those are the ways that the churches can help, and also donate. Donations are very important.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And there are ways to do some of these things through Fellowship Southwest, which Anira can talk to us about. I think she would like to.
Sorry.
Yes, sorry. I've got a little stuck there. Give me one moment.
And by the way, some of you have been asking great questions in the chat, and I know we're almost to an hour, but I do want to give you an opportunity to ask Elket some more questions too.
Can you all see this?
Mhm.
Well, I just wanted to share some different ways that you can get involved with Fellowship Southwest. One of those ways is to take a border trip. We can help facilitate and help get you connected to our network of pastors on the border and be able to go and help them. There's many things that you can do on the border with them. We can get creative and also based on the needs that they have at the same time. There's also a need for humanitarian aid, as Elket was sharing, and also other things that sometimes you'd be surprised that they need. Just a church who came back from a vision trip last week collected tents, collected a whole truckload full of tents, and are being at this moment picked up and taken down to the valley. And so anything that you might think is not needed, more than likely it might be needed. And we can find creative ways as well to be able to get those down to the valley if that's not something that you're able to do. Another thing is to stay engaged with Fellowship Southwest. Every week we have a newsletter that goes out, and in that newsletter we share about the different needs that there might be with our different border pastor network. We also have information about ways to advocate, or just stories. Stories are one of the most important ways to get the message across. And sometimes we don't get to go down to the border, or we might not know somebody with these stories, but these stories can help you share that message with your church family or with your community. I also want to encourage you, we're going to have a conference in September 8th and 9th here in Dallas, Texas. We would love to have you. That's another way for you to stay engaged. Another way is to advocate. Elket shared a little bit more about that, about contacting your lawmakers and asking them to fix our immigration system. On February the 28th, Fellowship Southwest will be having an advocacy day here in Austin, Texas. If you're in Texas, if you're not, you're more than welcome to come as well. It'd be a great opportunity for you to learn, especially if it's not something that you are familiar with, and going to meet with your legislators and be able to speak to them about the needs that are important to your family and your community. And lastly, another way that you can help is by giving. Something I love about Fellowship Southwest, not just because I work for Fellowship Southwest, is that we have designated accounts that everything that you give goes directly to the ministries that we work with. And so because of generous donors, we're able to give directly to these ministries. And so there's many ways that you can get involved. And if you need to get a hold of me, you can do so very simply at anira@fellowshipsouthwest.org. And you'll just stay engaged with our newsletter and social media, and you'll be able to learn a lot more about ways that you can get involved and help with migrants and other ministries that we are also involved with. So I'll give it back to you, Cameron, so you can talk about any questions anybody else might have in regards to what you and Elket covered today.
Okay. I'm going to stop our Facebook live stream. Goodbye, Facebook. And take us off of focus mode. And so now we should be able to see each other. Maybe. Can you all see each other? Okay. So if anyone has any questions, I thought that might make it easier to have conversation. Does anyone have any questions for Elket before we close? Or for me or Anira? Okay, David.
Okay, so I was blessed, man. I just got to go down there to the border with the TB Maston Foundation. So we just went to the leadership deal down there. It was amazing, so informative. And so I'm in the Victoria area, and we've already started. I've talked to my church, talked to some people in my community since I've been back. We're going to be assisting with the church down in Rio Bravo that they haven't been assisting with those efforts. They've just been assisting kind of like with the poverty and homelessness in Rio Bravo, but they are open to it being sort of like a day refuge for people on that journey. We're going to be sending them hygiene and water, food, clothes, and stuff of that nature. We're working that out. But here in Victoria, particularly, how do we find those groups of people that might need some assistance, or is there a way to get in touch with somebody locally that we could go? Like, I heard that there was a place here in Victoria that's housing asylum seeking children. I don't know if they're orphans or what that is, but at my church there we have children's ministry that would be willing to go do VBSs or just show up to support in ways that we can. How do we get in touch with those things that are already happening in our local areas?
Okay, thank you. So I think it's a threefold answer. Sorry. First, let's talk about the kids first. So when you're talking about kids, it's typically unaccompanied migrant children. Those kids are under the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, and they have caseworkers. Those caseworkers try to link, if you can say, or connect the kid with within a family, try to relocate this kid with a family member or within a family setting. And typically there are agencies that take care of these kids. We're talking about Baptist, about Southwest Keys, BCFS. So those organizations, I really do not know about which ones in Victoria. What's the one that's operating in Victoria? I know the one that's operating in Harlingen, but I don't know the one that's operating in Victoria. And they're very, I would say, sensitive to expose those unaccompanied migrant children to anything. And so what I would first recommend you is to see who is the agency that's operating there, and talking to the person in charge if they allow you guys to do that BBS. Because I know that at least here in Harlingen, Valley Baptist Missions and Education Center it's allowed at least an hour every week to do worship with them, and that transforms a lot of kids' lives, and they get a lot of hope. The second thing I was going to tell you, the second part of the answer is we have a partner here. So we have a partner here in the Valley that may be able to help you with. I'm talking about Pastor probably Navarro, but I'm not. But he may be able to send some people your way. But depending on what type of ministry is your church trying to do? Like right now, we have a church that actually is having a mid to long-term shelter, and they get some referrals from Pastor Navarro, who operates a respite center in Brownsville. And so whenever he's got these migrants that are going to stay there for probably a week or two until they get to their sponsor, they contact because they need to onboard or unload, if you can say, they contact this church and they come here and pick that person up. That's the second thing. The third comment I would say is, how do we get to the migrants and help them in our community? The third way is, one, I told you, coming to the Valley, the different aspect about unaccompanied migrants. And the third thing is, you got to keep in mind that there are so many of the asylum seekers or migrants that are coming to the border, they already have a sponsor. So a lot of this is dependent on the migrant. So if they already have a sponsor in Victoria, the best way to deal with that is to talk to the sponsor and seek ways to help out that sponsor. So in a sense, it would be, let's say that you have a connection here in the Valley or in a port of entry, and they see someone that is going to Victoria, they'll give you a call. So those are the 3 ways you can connect based on what you told me. But we would need to have more conversations and connections to make that happen.
Great. Any other questions? Okay. Matt.
Thanks for all the information today. You guys are fantastic. I'm up in the Kansas City area, and we actually see an uptick in some of Venezuelans and Nicaraguans recently, even coming through that we've been able to connect with through some different areas. My question is on the sponsorship. Some other local churches in the area that I know have been interested in sponsorship. And I was just, we've worked with refugees primarily from East Africa for some time. And so I'm more familiar with that part of it. But I guess part of my concern was some of the churches that are discussing it, maybe not understanding what's involved in a sponsorship, or beginning to say, well, I'll sponsor, but not knowing, like we talked about, the 6-month inability for people to work legally and or possibly provide themselves. So I was just curious if families are saying, oh, we're going to begin this sponsorship, or if someone else is saying we're going to sponsor someone, what is the vetting involved, or what could they expect to go through in that process if it's not for a family member? Some other folks who are working with me in the area are sponsoring family members, which I kind of put in a different category. But if someone was just sponsoring someone they've met randomly, or there are a few people who had done some Ukrainian relief who had met someone in Ukraine or in Poland trying to sponsor at that point in time. So just curious.
Yeah, so it will depend. One of the most difficult, and I would say strange words, it's very versatile, whatever. It's sponsor. So you can sponsor, we typically think about the sponsor that is sponsoring someone who is asking for a legal permanent residency. Well, that person has to give more information and stuff like that, because you're saying that you're paying for this person until this person becomes a citizen or something like that. But when we're talking about in the context of asylum seekers, it will depend right now about what type of sponsoring are you doing. So are you talking about the sponsoring of people from these 4 nationalities that we talked about, Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, Cubans, and Haitians? If those are the ones that your church is trying to sponsor, they can actually go ahead and do it through USCIS. They have a website. It's all done electronically. All you have to prove, and organizations can do this as well, is that you are going to be able to pretty much maintain this person for 2 years in the United States. That does not mean that you're going to be maintaining this person for 2 years. You have to prove that you are going to maintain, that you have the ability to maintain, if you can say, or this person for 2 years. Because if this person files for asylum, and obviously, and sometimes if that person gets paroled, they can ask for a work permit and they can start working. Are you getting what I'm saying? Don't think that because you're saying 2 years is that, hey,
You have to support them financially for 2
you
years.
have, correct. If you help them, you actually can help, you actually can support them for less amount of time. That's the word I was looking for, instead of maintaining support. So you can support them for I would say 6 months, 5 years, 8 months, and you can actually work with that person to resettle, in a sense, in the community and help them file for asylum if that's what they need. But the first thing you're going to need is a person that you know it's trustworthy, because to be honest with you, hey, Anita and I can talk for Anita, but I know my people, you know, and you know, you have to know you're going to have to create that bond and that relationship, and then after that you can go ahead just submit financial evidence to the USCIS, and it's an I-1858. It's done electronically, and the government is at USCIS is actually being very they're not being that restrictive granting those, and so a church can come in and say, I can provide the shelter, and a brother of the church can say, well, I found I can bring them food, and another person can say, I can't transport that person. Hey, we're good, but you just have to come up with a plan and show it to the government.
Okay.
So, and it's not that difficult. They're even accepting pay stubs as evidence. So, not just taxes from last year or anything. It can be pay stubs. They're being very, especially, I think that with organizations, they're going to be a little bit more cautious.
As evidence that you have the resources to support the asylum.
Yeah, it's a totally financial analysis.
Okay. And is that something is that kind of on your list of what churches can do, that churches should be?
Yeah, that is something that the churches can do. I forgot to put that.
Yeah, but that we should include that. Okay.
Yeah, and I put in the chat uscis.gov CHNB, chart of 4 letters of the countries that we've been talking about, and Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and there you're gonna find the information.
Okay.
Can I also add to that, okay, is that many times migrants who are coming have family members or friends who are in different cities who are being sponsored by them. But no, and that's the case for many Latinos in regards to the Latino community that I can only speak about. And however, that could be a big burden on that family. And so being able to come alongside that family and be able to help those families to either provide similar things to what Elket was sharing, right? You might not have to host them in the home or in a church, but definitely maybe provide that extra help, extra respite for those families or friends who are hosting friends from other countries.
Yeah, it makes me think of, if someone has a new baby, or is sick in the hospital or something, you might do a meal calendar for that family, and you could consider doing that for a family who's sponsoring. That's a nice idea. Any other questions? Well, thanks for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much.
Hopefully we'll be able to continue these conversations. There's so much to cover.
Yes. That's something we're hoping on doing, is be able to have more conversations like this throughout the year on different subjects. So we hope you'll join us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. God bless you all.
Bye.
Bye.